You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
The Dapper Dinosaur here. I am back to continue the series about Kent Hovind's Creation Boot Camp. If you've seen the previous episodes, you'll be aware that the man giving this talk isn't Hovind himself, but rather Dan Biddle of Genesis Apologetics. Although Kent is there in the background. When last we left off, Dan was wrapping up his point that the fact that the fossil-bearing strata tend to be sediment and sometimes have volcanic ash means that somehow there was evidence of a global flood. It made absolutely no sense whatsoever. He also seemed to think that the position of real science is that all dinosaur fossils everywhere, and of every age, were directly caused by the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous. He is not a very smart man. But let's see what he's got for us in this, our last episode of the series.
So here's an example. Let's just take a look at the Morrison Formation.
The Morrison Formation is like my hometown.
That's a 600,000 square mile chunk of this million-mile kill zone.
One cool thing about the Morrison Formation is that it can be at least partially directly radiometrically dated. You see, the bushy basin member of the formation, which Dan has already mentioned, contains a significant amount of volcanic ash, allowing something that is normally impossible, the radiometric dating of a fossil-bearing sedimentary stratum. It's pretty cool, isn't it? Also, there is no kill zone. Dan just thinks that the fact that there's really only a few parts of North America with extensive Mesozoic sedimentary rock is somehow evidence for the flood. It doesn't make any sense at all, which is a theme for Dan.
So if you go into Morrison, Colorado, that's in the heart of Morrison, the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation is a Jurassic formation, so it's the early stages of the flood.
Wouldn't that be the middle stages of the late stages? If the flood starts in the Cambrian and ends at the end of the Cretaceous? I don't know where Dan thinks the flood ends in the geological record. You'd think it would be blindingly obvious, and yet there's disagreement about it within young Earth creationism. And he keeps using these geological terms for rock systems like Jurassic, when Kent has many times said they are meaningless because there is no geological column.
Layers then were assigned an age and a name and an index fossil. Now this is very important. This was all done during the early 1800s. This geologic column is the Bible for the evolutionist. It can only be found one place in the world. The only place you can find the geologic column is in the textbooks. In the textbooks, they talk about, here's an earth science textbook, about how, during the Cenozoic and Mesozoic and Paleozoic era, they've got it all figured out like, wow, this is, millions of years old, and it's just simple baloney.
And we have this Morrison Formation, and this, again, here we go. It's going to be hard to explain.
Harder than geology in general? I doubt that.
It's a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
I don't know if I've ever heard a worse description of a geological formation than mud pancake. Mudstone is a common component of the Morrison Formation, but it also contains conglomerate, siltstone, limestone, and sandstone. Further, I have no idea what makes it a pancake. It's not round, it wasn't made in a pan, and it's not cake. And I don't recommend eating it, no matter how much syrup you put on it. Although Google did once tell me that doctors recommend eating one small rock a day. So I don't know, nothing is real anymore. Nothing apart from this video, that is.
That spans 13 states.
Normally, I don't think of 13 as a particularly big number, but here I think it counts as big number, therefore God. I don't know, you keep your own creationist bingo card. It's not like there are real rules for prizes.
So let's just stop right there. How do you pull that off? How do you take mud
and silt, lime, sand, and clay? Let's not forget those.
And make a 300-foot thick layer of it and swath it over 13 states.
You don't. That's not what the Morrison Formation is. The Morrison Formation isn't a single deposition across the whole area. We can tell because a single depositional event tends to leave behind a single layer of a particular kind of rock. But the Morrison Formation is a complex set of various rocks, sometimes interbedded, that vary in composition and time of deposition. What unites it is first, that humans are a bit arbitrary, and second, that it represents a mostly continuous and geographically isolated segment of the Jurassic period. Also, it's significant because of the high number of fossil finds there. Science is not faced with the problem of explaining the Morrison Formation via a single mechanism. There is no single mechanism of any specificity beyond sedimentation, compaction, and cementing that can explain the whole thing. A flood is physically impossible as the mechanism for creating the formation, as things like limestone simply are not deposited in floods. The formation is made of things like lakes, floodplains, rivers, etc., all of which are just doing normal geology stuff for about 10 million years. That's more than enough time for the up to 200 meters of Morrison Formation to deposit over a wide area.
Again, it screams worldwide flood.
Which part is it that screams worldwide flood? Is it the shale and limestone that couldn't have been deposited in a flood? Tsunami or no?
So it's 300 feet thick. It probably started out much thicker.
That's true.
This is in fact how sedimentary rock works. It must compactify, which usually involves squeezing out water in order to be closely packed enough that it can cement. This usually reduces the height of any given column of sediment anywhere from 60 to 80%.
But if we fly down a Boeing 747, just for size comparison, that's only 230 feet long.
Anything that's over 230 feet in any dimension will exceed in that dimension the length of a Boeing 737. That's how length works. Football fields are also longer than 737s. Most 3-story buildings are taller than a Boeing 737 is long. I don't know why this information is here. Do Dan and Ken's audiences normally have trouble comparing numbers to see which is bigger?
We can just by comparison, like, okay, well, this is over 330 feet thick. Actually started out at over 600 feet thick, but it's been compacted over time.
Actually, I think that's a pretty big underestimate. I think a much more reasonable estimate is up to 1,600 feet thick. I'm not sure if any of that matters, though.
Empire State Building, 1,470 feet. And we know, and here's the key, did you know that every known Jurassic dinosaur species in America is found in that single layer?
Well, first, it's not a single layer. You can tell because it's composed of members, which themselves are composed of units. So calling it a single layer is just wrong. Also, it's just not true that all known North American Jurassic dinosaurs are from the Morrison Formation. Numerous Jurassic footprints have been found in Massachusetts and Connecticut. There are also Jurassic ichnofossils from Nova Scotia, Nuevo Leon, Puebla, Oaxaca, and the DC metro area. Granted, these aren't body fossils, but ichnofossils are fossils, and ichnogenera are real genera. If Dan wanted to say that all known Jurassic body fossils of dinosaurs are from the Morrison Formation, then he'd be right. And of course, my source for that is simply the same as his source, PaleoDB.
Over 50 species of dinosaurs buried together family style.
What the f*** does that mean? They were all sharing one big bucket of fries? This is a geological formation, not a goddamn Italian restaurant where you get a whole lasagna to feed 5 people.
Over 13 states in a 300-foot thick mud pancake.
Over the course of 10 million years, give or take about 1 million years. Seems pretty reasonable to me.
Who in their right mind is going to believe that an asteroid pulled that off?
No one. The last parts of the Morrison Formation were deposited some 80 million years before the start of the Cretaceous. We are currently closer to the last Tyrannosaurus rex in time than T-Rex was to the deposition of any part of the Morrison Formation. The Morrison Formation has absolutely nothing to do with the Chicxulub impact. It's like asking how George Washington could have won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, or wondering why Genghis Khan didn't conquer ancient Sumeria. Dan is seemingly incapable of understanding that time exists and that events happen in a sequence.
You have to be blind to not see it was a worldwide flood.
You know, false dichotomies are always bad, but when one of the two options isn't even the thing your opponents or anyone else thinks is true, it's especially bad. Either I'm right or this obvious strawman that no one has ever held is right. Which one? Yeah, not a good argument. Watch, I can do it too. You see, either you have to accept Wicca as the one true religion, or you have to believe, as the Christians do, that in fact celery is a tool of Satan created to increase the lust of Christian women so that they fornicate with the heathens. I feel like Dan would not find that argument a compelling argument against Christianity. For the same reason, either you accept a worldwide flood as the cause of all dinosaur fossils, or you accept a single asteroid impact as the cause of all dinosaur fossils, is not a compelling argument against science.
That's the only way you're going to bury every known species of dinosaurs in the Jurassic layers over a 13-state region, 600,000 square miles, 300 feet thick of mud.
Maybe if you, for some reason, require them to all be buried in one event, but that's not what happened. Really, this whole argument is defeated by just pointing out that there's not a great ontological necessity to the idea that all dinosaurs were buried in one event.
And they're still digging up dinosaurs from that area today. So
That's true.
here's all the fossil occurrences, all the different genera,
Not genre.
hundreds of different species of plants and animals, and that's just what we found so far.
Yep, such a large area is likely to have had even more plants and animals than have been found.
So now let's close down with a few more evidences.
I actually get asked pretty frequently about the word evidences. Typically the word evidence is not a countable noun in English, and so cannot be pluralized. And if it needs to be quantified, it needs a counting word, usually piece, such as 4 pieces of evidence. However, even as late as the late 19th century, use of evidence as a count noun was actually pretty common throughout the English language. It persists today almost entirely in Christian theology and apologetics, but it is not something new that they are doing. It's just that they are keeping an older use of the word, when the usage of the word changed in most of society. Is it wrong to use evidence this way? Well, it is not standard, and most editors outside of the world of Christian publishing would ask for a correction. But in terms of language use, the idea of right or wrong is kind of weird. Further, even if it were an unambiguous error to use the word evidences, which I contend it is not, it doesn't really matter to the argument anyone is making, and so it's not really worth my time to correct it each time. Indeed, I'm not even really correcting it here, but rather explaining why I don't really need to, as well as why the word is even used by people like Dan Biddle and Kent Hovind.
As we go through, I think this is one of my leading evidences that personally convinced me.
Ah yes, the alleged Triceratops horn discovered by Mark Armitage and the late Kevin Anderson. Here's the thing, we don't know what that is, but we'll get into it more soon.
This is a dinosaur Triceratops horn that was discovered by Mark Armitage, and when you demineralize it and put it under a microscope and take a couple of forceps, you can still pull and stretch this dinosaur bone.
First, you can't stretch bone like that. Bone is hydroxyapatite. It is brittle and non-elastic biomineral. Second, we don't know what's being stretched there because we don't actually know what Mark found. He found a horn in a place that is known to have Maastrichtian Cretaceous dinosaurs, including Triceratops, but there's a complication. The area also has Pleistocene alluvium, that is, debris that was washed into channels. About 20 miles away, an extinct bison fossil was found in an area that has about the same geology as the Beisch Ranch where Armitage found his horn. He also did not make a site map, gather sufficient in situ photographs of the horn. He did not do a cladistic analysis to show that his identification of the horn as Triceratops horridus was accurate. He did not characterize the matrix the horn was found in, and his location data was an obscure system used to divide parcels of land up for tax purposes as opposed to the GPS coordinates which are now standard, and which resulted in a huge multi-acre area. I've since worked with friend of the channel Dr. Dino, no relation, to see if he can pinpoint the location of the find, and we found that it was indeed in an area where Pleistocene alluvium is possible, so we have no way to conclude that this is not a bison latifrons horn. Further, in what few pictures we have of the horn, there is visible plant contamination, which means there is likely much other contamination, meaning that even if the horn is an actual Triceratops horn, there's no way to know if much of what Armitage has uncovered is actually contamination from modern organisms, or if it was actually intrinsic to the animal whose horn this was. In other words, because Mark Armitage doesn't know the first thing about paleontology, he ruined any ability for science to actually examine his work and either validate it or falsify it. Now, do I think it's a Triceratops horn? I honestly don't know. Talking to Shauna, one of the owners of the ranch, has made me less skeptical of the Triceratops claim, but I certainly do not believe it. I remain agnostic on the question.
So it was a horn, you demineralize it, and it's still got stretchy, soft materials to it.
As far as the demineralize and you get stretchy stuff, yes, that can be done with some dinosaur bones, and it seems to have been done with whatever it was that Mark found.
I dug into this field hard. I spent weeks in this field. I did demineralization work myself. I had a dinosaur demineralization lab I donated to ICR.
I don't believe him except about the ICR donation. I really doubt that Dan Biddle, PhD in communication, who thinks that the scientific explanation for all dinosaur fossils everywhere is the Chicxulub impactor, actually did any real experiments on real dinosaur fossils. At most, I think he may have visited Armitage's lab and pressed a few buttons at Armitage's direction, and that he also probably read some stuff from other creationists about soft tissues and fossils.
I'm 100% convinced that these dinosaurs are young.
Okay, but Dan is someone who believes that scientists think that the Morrison Formation was created by an asteroid that wouldn't hit Earth for some 80 million years after the formation was done being deposited. So his believing something, if anything, should give you pause, and reason to think that that thing is false, not reason to think that it's true.
Because it's not just one different type of soft tissue product that we're finding in these dinosaur bones. Like here we might be seeing collagen and keratin as it's still stretchable and pliable. It used to be 14 different types of bioorganics that we're finding in dinosaur bones. Now we're up to 16.
I'm not sure what the argument is. If only 7 biomolecular fossils had been found in dinosaurs, would that make them old? But now that it's over a dozen, they're young? The preservation mechanism could work on many or few biomolecules. What matters is whether or not there is a plausible preservation mechanism to allow biomolecules to last for the purported period of time. If there is such a mechanism, then it could be applicable to thousands of biomolecules. That wouldn't make the preservation any more or less plausible.
16 different flavors of dinosaur products.
16 flavors, eh? Well, Dr. Pepper has 23 flavors, so I think I'll start worshipping the good Dr. Pepper. He is the bringer of carbonation, after all. I'll also renounce Mr. Pibb and all of his works.
That are left over by the flood, that are soft, that evolutionists say should all be gone by now, but it's not, so they're really stuck.
Evolutionists, huh? Let us pray. Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come, thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen. Except that they don't say they shouldn't exist. They obviously do exist, and reality is the final arbiter of what should exist scientifically speaking. Now, at first, scientists were extremely skeptical of the idea that these biomolecules were really from the dinosaurs because there was no known mechanism by which they could survive, and contamination is always a concern in laboratory settings. Since then, some mechanisms that are at least plausible have been found, such as iron cross-linking. But even if we had not yet found such a mechanism, the choices before us are that we abandon virtually everything we know about biology, geology, nuclear physics, chemistry, etc., and then decide that some bits of biomolecules are young, or we assume that there's some chemistry we aren't aware of. Obviously, the first option is what scientists went with. Dan would apparently prefer that anytime anything unexpected happens in the world of science, that we just start over completely.
Here's a picture of all the 16 different types of bioorganic soft tissues that they're finding.
I noticed that at least 3 of these just look like rocks or regular body fossils. And also, who uses pictures of these things without labels? What good is that?
And it's not just me, it's not creationists saying it. We've compiled, actually Dr. Brian Thomas from ICR compiled a spreadsheet of 120 peer-reviewed journal articles. These are not creationist publications. They're from histology journals, from biology journals, from bone study journals that have established these 16 different types of bioorganics that are found in dinosaur bones.
Yeah, because it turns out that there isn't actually a big conspiracy to hide the data. It's just that the data don't actually support any of the distinctive contentions of young Earth creationism.
We're talking about things like keratin, red blood cells, histones, fex histones, collagen, blood cells, blood vessels, arteries. It's all there.
Well, it is and it isn't. Look, this is dinosaur skin. The scientific consensus is that it's tens of millions of years old. Skin is soft tissue and really can survive for tens of millions of years. Yet, here it is. So, what's going on? Well, you're not actually looking at skin, you're looking at a fossil in the shape of skin. The skin itself didn't survive intact for millions of years. It turned into something very stable, and that stable thing lasted for tens of millions of years. But that's also the case with these other instances of preserved soft tissue. For instance, intact collagen hasn't been found. Degraded and cross-linked collagen has been found. Hemoglobin hasn't been found. Stable porphyrins that are derived from heme groups have been found, and they likely originated in hemoglobin. So in one sense, Dan is right that these soft tissues can't last millions of years. He's just wrong that they need to.
And these dinosaur bones that are supposedly millions of years old, the last 2 that they discovered are dinosaur cartilage. And that's not an impression of cartilage, that's the real cartilage.
So this is, near as I can tell, based on the 2020 paper, Evidence of Proteins, Chromosomes, and Chemical Markers on DNA in Exceptionally Preserved Dinosaur Cartilage by Alida M. Balliol et al., published in the April issue of the National Science Review. While normally I would caution against quoting the first line of the abstract, in this case it's rather important. The first sentence of this paper is, A histological ground section from a duck-billed dinosaur nestling, Hyparchosaurus stebingeri, revealed microstructures morphologically consistent with nuclei and chromosomes in cells within calcified cartilage. So, was cartilage found? Well, cartilage is made of water, collagen, peptoglycans, and a few other proteins here and there. So it's not really made of calcium. So no, this isn't cartilage. In the same way that the skin I showed earlier isn't really skin. Calcium-rich minerals can last indefinitely, and so there's no reason to suspect that this bone is young because fossilized cartilage was found. Now, the idea of chromosomes being detectable is certainly interesting, although I remain skeptical. But hey, it'd be super cool if a chromosome was found.
And then the last thing that they just found is nerve cells.
The picture shown is figure 10 from the Mark Armitage paper, First Report of Peripheral Nerves in Bone of Triceratops horridus occipital condyle, published in Microscopy Today, March 1st, 2021. I've already talked about the problems with Armitage's work. This is meaningless, because Mark didn't do the bare minimum needed for his work to even be used as evidence in paleontology. This paper means as much to science as Mark reporting on how it feels when he puts his thumb up his ass and wiggles it around.
Actual nerve fibers, not permineralized impressions of it, but real dinosaur nerves, thanks to Mark Armitage and his team.
Which would be really cool, if Mark had bothered to actually document his find so that it could be verified. He didn't. And even my personal attempts to do so have simply come up with, we can't rule out bison, and we've been given no reason to think that it's Triceratops, besides that it was found near a place where Triceratops have been found, which isn't enough.
That's the 16th thing that they just found.
Well, since that doesn't count, I guess we're down to 15.
So how do you preserve dinosaur nerves for millions of years? You can't. These things are young.
Well, you could preserve them in the same way you preserve other things, letting them decay into a stable chemical system that retains the overall shape of the nerves. But there's also no reason to think that there are preserved nerves to explain. I believe Mark found nerves, but that's the thing. He found nerves in a bone of unknown origin from an unknown animal of an unknown age, and in which at least some modern biological contamination is seen in Mark's own pictures of the bone in question.
Here's a list of 120 different peer-reviewed science journals that have substantiated that they are in fact finding soft tissues from dinosaurs that span literally the entire Mesozoic.
Okay, so what?
So are these dinosaurs soft tissues really 65 million years old and older?
No, in most cases they're older. Only non-avian dinosaurs from the end of the Cretaceous would be that old. And really, it would be 66 million years old. Most dinosaurs aren't from the end of the Cretaceous. Non-avian dinosaurs lived on Earth for some 160 plus million years. Very few of them were around for just the end of the Cretaceous.
Or are they only about 4,400 years to 4,500 years old?
No, that is physically impossible for more reasons than I can even count.
I think the evidence shows that there really are younger.
Yeah, but Dan is also a idiot who thinks that the scientific consensus is that all dinosaurs who ever lived or died did so in the same year. Dan's assessment of the evidence is as reliable as a dead carp's assessment of the evidence.
So let's take the last few minutes here and jump into dinosaur lifespans.
Last few minutes? We're not even halfway done this episode. He still has like 15 minutes left.
But before we do that, I want to comment on one of the bioorganic soft tissues.
Which is something he could have done before, saying he was going to move on.
And that's collagen. So bone is made up of bone mineral and collagen. Human bones are that way. Animal bones are that way.
Yes, because human bones are a subset of animal bones. Because humans are animals. It's amazing that creationists will readily admit things like that humans are vertebrates or mammals, but then pretend that they're not animals, even though vertebrata and mammalia are groups of animals. It's like saying that the Boston Red Sox are a baseball team, but then saying that they're not a sports team, even though baseball is a sport. Humans can't be mammals and not animals. That's not how it works. You can still believe in human exceptionalism, and accept the very obvious fact that humans are animals.
It's an infusion of those two things. Bone minerals provide the hard enamel-like structure, and collagen provides the soft, pliable fibers and flexibility in bones. That's why we don't break our bones so easily when you fall down. It's got some soft, flexible stuff, and they're provided by the collagen.
That's true.
So collagen has a known decay rate. Scientists have been studying the decay rate of collagen for years.
Of course, there's a problem with that. Really more than one problem, but I'll focus on one of them here. The rates at which chemical reactions occur are highly contingent on things like pressure and temperature, unlike the rates at which spontaneous nuclear reactions occur, which are essentially unaffected by anything like pressure or temperature. So no matter what rate is quoted in the text, it will be contingent on the conditions of the experiment. which may or may not be met in the environment of any given fossil. Creationists love to take things like the decay rate of a protein, or the rate of change in the strength of the dipole moment of Earth's magnetosphere, or the recession rate of the Moon from Earth, things that we know are not constant and can change, and then extrapolate them infinitely back in time as if they were constants in order to create reductio ad absurdum arguments against science. While simultaneously they'll take things that we can't seem to vary, like the maximum deposition rate for limestone, or the rate at which nuclei spontaneously decay, and then pretend that maybe physics was just different in order to avoid the obvious implications of those processes that show their own ideas to be absurd ones.
Many scientists put it in the 10,000 to 30,000 year mark.
I wonder if Dan has a citation for that. I mean, if it's most scientists who would say that, then surely he got that idea somewhere and he could tell us where. Odd that he doesn't. But, as I said, I don't much care what the estimated shelf life of collagen is under normal conditions. And of course, there's the problem that collagen hasn't been found in dinosaurs. At least not in the sense of intact collagen that hasn't decayed at all.
We're not talking about half-life, we're talking about maximum shelf life. So most scientists will come out and say, yeah, I think if you take a cow bone, throw it out in the mud, cover it up, after 10,000 years
I'm free! It's time to conquer Earth!
or so, the collagen is just going to be gone. It's got a half-life, it's going to start chipping away, and it's just going to be gone. Some scientists will stretch it out to maybe 30,000 years. Other people have said 100,000 years, and there's a study that came out by Buckley and others that said, well, we're going to really get scientific about this and really push it and say, we think that collagen can last between 300,000 years to 900,000 years.
None of which is contradictory to finding collagen remnants in dinosaur bones far older, because the collagen didn't last. The whole argument is predicated on the idea that these soft tissue finds are of intact proteins that are essentially identical to the proteins that the animal had in life. But that's simply not what's being found. And that's on top of the fact that chemistry is context dependent. So just coming up with a particular shelf life for collagen that's broadly applicable doesn't really mean it's applicable under all contexts.
That's the official position of evolutionists.
Let us pray. Our Darwin, who art in the British Museum, hallowed be thy name. Thy evolution come, thy selection be done, on land as it is in water. Give us this day our daily sexual selection as we sexually select, and lead us not into inbreeding, but deliver us from extinction. Amen.
You might or might not be surprised to learn that there is no such thing as an official position of evolutionists. First, evolutionist is a weird word, but second, science doesn't operate by official proclamations from prophets, imams, popes, sheikhs, or synods of bishops. There are no required beliefs or prohibited beliefs. You can't actually be a scientific heretic. Now, I know what you're wondering. How then can I call people like young earth creationists, Alan Fiducia, anti-vaxxers, flat earthers, or electric universe types non-scientists? Well, while science doesn't have dogmas handed down from on high from official positions, what it does have is a scientific method, and the need to provide evidence for claims. Now, the scientific method is actually a collection of variations on the theme of empiricism, and different branches of science do not all conduct themselves in exactly the same way. For example, there are a few laboratory experiments in astronomy, whereas in particle physics we really only advance one lab experiment at a time. But the key is empiricism. We get data about the world, we come up with ideas about how those data relate to each other, and we test those ideas by making predictions about future data. Then, getting those data and seeing if they match the prediction within a margin of error. Importantly, you don't get to just discard relevant data. Now, it's true that no one person can reasonably have all the relevant data to hand and incorporate it into their experiment, but that's the importance of peer review and replication. If there is something a single worker or single team misses, others will likely bring what was missed to bear in the discussion, whether it be as notes from a peer review or a subsequent study. So what about those people whom I've mentioned as pseudoscientists? Well, they fundamentally do not care about data, ignore them when they're inconvenient, and do not accept corrections. For example, a real scientist, on learning that their hypothesis would require the physical properties of the Earth to change by several orders of magnitude and would have melted the planet, would abandon or at least heavily modify that hypothesis. Creationists just go with it anyway. Similarly, since there is simply no evidence that vaccines cause autism, anyone who says that they do did not get that belief as a result of scientific investigation, and anyone who keeps believing it after the lack of supporting evidence is pointed out is being anti-science. So science doesn't have official beliefs. It has beliefs that are supported by the currently available evidence, beliefs that are not, and therefore are not currently part of science, and ideas that there is evidence against, which if held, put you squarely in the anti-science box. Creationism, as preached by Dan Biddle, is firmly in the anti-science box.
So, and then you can hear a pin drop after that because you think, all right, that's all? That's all you're going to stretch collagen to? The maximum half-life or the maximum shelf life doesn't even reach 1,000,000 years?
Yep, now where's that intact collagen? Because it's sure not in dinosaur bones. Okay, honestly, I'm tired of him just lying about soft tissues, or if I'm being charitable, having absolutely no understanding of what it means when someone says they found the remnants of proteins or even DNA. I'm going to skip ahead for my own sanity, and so you don't have to keep hearing me say over and over again that what was found wasn't actually an intact protein, and that those intact molecules did indeed decay. You get the point. Further repetition won't help.
So I was a testifying expert for about 20 years in state and federal court cases dealing with statistics and research.
Well, that's horrifying. Maybe anyone whose conviction was aided by this moron's so-called expertise could use his ramblings about this absolute nonsense on behalf of a convicted fraud as some kind of evidence that their conviction should be overturned, or at least that they should get a new trial.
And I can't say I discovered this because I'm just recycling the research that was done by others on this topic, but I can say I took the raw data myself and pressure tested it as hard as I could, looking at what's called power law curves and polynomial regression.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Get on with it!
You guys, there is amazing ironclad proof that people used to live longer before the flood than they do now.
Ironclad proof, eh? This better be a lot better than some guy running a regression analysis on the ages of the people in the genealogies in Genesis.
Well, we also now know that it's a biological decay curve.
As opposed to what? Non-biological decay curves? You'll probably be interested to know that a search for that term brings up creationist genealogical nonsense in the first two results, and then just a bunch of math about decay curves. So no, a biological decay curve isn't really a thing.
And we only have one of two answers for it. Number one, it was based upon a concerted scam of the Bible authors over 3,000 years to systematically, through multiple generations, somehow slowly decline the lifespans of people from an average of 912 years before the flood to the years that we have now, and pass along this lie through multiple generations to make it slope down a nice gradual slope.
First, there's no reason to think that it has been a millennia-long conspiracy. Genesis wasn't written over the course of 1,000 years. It was written as a few different texts by at least 3 authors, possibly more, and compiled and redacted during the Babylonian exile. All that's needed to get consistent dates is for the redactor to want the ages to be consistent and grow as they go back in time. All this would take is some idea of fractions and multiplication. The Babylonians were mathematical pioneers, and any foreign scribe in Babylon would likely have been exposed to more than enough mathematics to be able to do things like multiply the ages of the patriarchs by some number between 1 and 2 to get an exponential age growth going back in time. And also, he could then just vary that age from the baseline for his own reasons. Really, this whole thing requires one guy who's okay at math during the Babylonian exile. It's not a super extraordinary thing. And I'm not saying this is definitely how the ages got to be where they are, just that if we want to take the root of the ages being just made up, we really don't need anything unusual or far-fetched to account for that idea.
Which is, of course, preposterous, because you can't do that for 3,000 years, carry on a multi-generational scam like that.
Well, there was no reason to keep it going for thousands of years over multiple generations. Just one guy doing it one time is enough.
Or the Genesis lifespans are real recorded lifespans, and something is causing humans to not go from 900 years lifespan before the flood and then all of a sudden drop down to 70, 80, 90 years. No, something caused them to fall down off of a slope.
I'd agree that this is at least a possibility that would explain the text. Of course, the bigger problem is that we know that the stories in the first bits of Genesis are bits of myth and legend that have from little to no historical or archaeological backing. And in the case of things like Genesis 1 through 11, basically none of it is historically true. So we can safely rule this option out until we have reason to even consider the possibility that these genealogies represent real ages of real people. Using these as evidence of the historicity of Genesis only makes sense if you start by accepting their historicity. That's classic question begging.
And it's called the biological decay curve. So let's take a look at this. We all know that people age. God built that in our gene code. Of course, it was related to the fall, but God knew that our lifespans were going to shrink, and especially shrink after the flood. So
that's a lot of assertions with no evidence, but whatever.
It looks like, after about 100 years, it's about all you're going to get, right? Well, how in the world are these people living so much longer before the flood? So if that's just what we got to see people age in 100 years, what about these guys that are living nearly 1,000 years?
Great question. It does seem like this is biologically impossible. And if you're arguing for something that seems biologically impossible, pointing out that the data fits a curve reasonably well doesn't really help. Also, this just feels like someone trying to argue that the Lord of the Rings is historical because of how realistic all the elven languages are. Using some internal consistency in a work of literature isn't evidence that that work of literature is historical. Conversely, though, it is the case that if a work of literature is inconsistent, that makes it less likely to be historical. The problem, of course, is that Genesis is internally consistent all over the place. The text can't even figure out who sold Joseph into slavery.
Average of the patriarchs before the flood was 912 years. And I just bring up this graphic to show you we really have to think how long that is. 912 years, the average lifespan.
By saying 912 years, we're being told how long that is. What else is there to think about? We were given a number and a unit. That's all we need.
So before the flood, we have all this data from Scripture that shows, Adam's living 930, his son Seth 912 years, Methuselah is the guy that lasted the longest. He was 969. Noah was 950 years. But then if we go after the flood in Table 2, we see an interesting phenomenon that it doesn't just go from 900 and some years before the flood to just 80. It starts gradually declining, 600 years, 438, 433, 464, but it's not right all of a sudden. It's a very gradual, predictable slope that goes down all the way to where we have Abraham living 175 years old, and Moses, I think, was 120. So it starts sloping down.
I feel like this has to be the least rhetorically powerful argument for the history of Genesis that I've ever heard. Let me know if you think that there is any rhetorical value to this argument down in the comments. I really don't get it. Number goes down, therefore Genesis is history. I don't even get how that's supposed to work.
Well, when you statistically plot it all out, here's what it looks like. You've got the average lifespan of people before the flood, 912 years. You have the flood event, and then there's a curve. It starts sloping down, 600 years, 500, 400, 300. It goes on down. They decrease exponentially.
But the decrease isn't actually exponential. It's just that you can fit a decay curve to it. You can also fit a line to it. If you use the ages from Noah to Abraham, you can get a line with a fit measured by r squared of 0.78864. Sure, a second order polynomial gives you a fit with an r squared of 0.8787, so slightly better, but not by that much. The problem really is that we only have a few data points. Really only 11. With 11 data points, you could fit all sorts of curves to the data. It doesn't really mean much. Any data will tend to have a curve or a line of best fit, and that's not special. Does Dan have a control for this experiment? Like maybe the Sumerian king lists? Not that I can see. Well, let's try it. I'll use the kings Ubaru Tutu through Atab, that is the last antediluvian king, through the 10th post-diluvian king. The years in that case are 18,600, 1,200, 360, 670, 420, 300, 840, 960, 840, 900, and 600. Now look at that. Using the same regression, we get an even better fit with an r-squared value of 0.9056. Now I should note that the years here are regnal years, not ages of death, but I don't really see why that would matter. Also, I got the regnal periods from the Wikipedia page. So if the argument is that a decay curve with a close fit is evidence of historicity, then it seems like the Sumerian king list is a better source of historicity than the Bible. Of course, the problem for Dan is that if that's the case, then it's not his god who's responsible for the flood, it's the gods of ancient Mesopotamia. If Dan wants to reject this, then he'll have to abandon the idea that just having a good fit to a decay curve is evidence of historicity.
Well, who's going to figure this out? Dr. John Sanford figured it out. He's a Cornell-trained geneticist.
So he knows the importance of having a control, which means he should have also done the work to compare the biblical genealogy to similar things from the ancient Near East, like non-biblical king lists or genealogies, yet he didn't.
That's suspicious. That's weird.
Wrote a book called Genetic Entropy.
Well, it's Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome, and I've read that book, but it's been a minute. I don't remember anything in there about a regression analysis of a Genesis genealogy, but yeah, he does explain the shortening of lifespans by genetic entropy. Of course, as I've covered elsewhere, genetic entropy is mathematically impossible. It's barely even coherent. It's a nothing. I'm not going to get into it unless Dan does.
And as far as I'm concerned, he's proven using...
No, he hasn't. Generally, nothing in science is ever proven, but in this case, we can actually use the math of population genetics to prove 100% that his ideas simply cannot reflect what actually happens in populations, unless we're simply wrong about the very basics of genetics, like what a gene is, or about just how numbers like probability work at a fundamental level.
Good takes on modern science. That when you take when you create what's called a genetic bottleneck, and you take the however many people were living before the flood. There's lots of dates before, lots of debates about how many people were living before the flood. But when you take the genetic variety of people who were living before the flood and bottleneck them down to just 8 people, you've got Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives. 8 people, put them on the ark. Something happens when they get off the ark and they start inbreeding. The mutations begin exponentially increasing.
You know what, Dan? You Trina Breed asshole. That's the dumbest shit I've heard since Uncooked Matthew told me that the Bible was written in pre-Yiddish and that the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't really read the New Testament. Inbreeding is definitionally when genetic diversity goes down in a population over generations and mutations increase in genetic diversity. They're opposites, and Sanford knows that. Bottlenecks don't cause mutations, they reduce genetic diversity. Genetic entropy pretends that that's a good thing, because according to genetic entropy, the more mutations, the worse, which is identical to saying the more genetic diversity, the worse is for population. Of course, that's dumb as as anyone involved in conservation will tell you. The lower genetic diversity of a population is, the worse it is for the survival of the population. This whole thing is just dumb as and I'm tired of creationists pretending that there's anything to this. They can fuck off with that, those dumb.
And as the mutations in our gene pool began exponentially increasing,
which they didn't, mutations don't increase exponentially. It's pretty linear. We can measure this in the real world. Also, how does this connect to the mathematical fit of a polynomial regression to the ages in a genealogy?
Our lifespans begin exponentially decreasing.
So let me get this right. If you get everything about population genetics wrong, then it can explain an unremarkable statistical result from doing analysis on a genealogy we've already known can't be true. And therefore, maybe the book the genealogy is from is historically accurate afterwards, even though that's mathematically and physically impossible. Cool. That's a very normal and not weird at all line of reasoning.
The two things are related. Mutations are sloping up, and lifespans are sloping down.
This is when Dapper realized that all of his life choices had been wrong.
They're related to this phenomenon known as a bottleneck event. So you've got your original population, you shake just 8 marbles into the jar, the surviving population begins breeding, and then you've got the new population.
I like how in his on-screen graphic we're supposed to see the color of the marbles as different genotypes, and how at the end the exact same colors are there as at the beginning, just in different proportions. It's almost like this graphic isn't illustrating his pretended increase in mutations after the bottleneck, which means it probably wasn't an image pulled from a creationist source, but rather, I'm guessing, a textbook made by a non-conspiracy theorist pseudoscientist.
When you do that, and humans are inbreeding, you're going to have exponentially increasing mutations.
Weird, because that's not what actual population geneticists think. I wonder where Dan got that. Oh, right, John Sanford. The guy who likes to lie to his audience about both basic genetics and things like what language the origin of species was written in. Like, really, this is akin to saying that the more ice you put in your water, the hotter it gets.
And of course, this is a post-fall world, so they're going to be living, shorter lifespans. Also, we also know that the pre-flood world was more conducive and designed for longer lifespans.
Ah yes, the pre-flood world with virtually no oxygen that had no plant life, since we don't even have fossil pollen in the rocks Dan thinks are pre-flood. You know, if Dan thinks that those are the conditions that are most conducive to long life, I encourage him to go hang in a sealed container with no food and barely any oxygen and see how long he lasts. It'll be a cool experiment in antediluvian longevity whose results can be replicated by all the professional young Earth creationists.
The Earth we're in today, lots of different factors that could also contribute to decreasing lifespans.
Such as?
But after looking into this, I really think it was something in our gene pool mostly that was driving the decreasing lifespans.
Interesting. Ken seems to think it's because of X-rays.
How many have ever had an X-ray before? I broke 9 bones growing up. When you break something, you go to the hospital and they'll say, okay, take off all your clothes and put this little gown on. You say, well, is this machine dangerous? He says, no, it's harmless. You say, how does this work, Doc? He says, well, when I mash the button, little X-ray bullets come out of that machine, and they're going to go right through your carcass, just like a machine gun, and they're going to blast a bunch of little holes in you, but you can't feel them. They're real tiny. They go right through, except the bone stops them, and it's going to make a reverse image of what's inside your body. But see, the holes heal up real fast, so you don't even feel them. But folks, did you know the sun X-rays you all day long? Except on cloudy days. Other than cloudy days, when water stops the X-rays, you get X-rayed every day of your life. And your poor skin feels the full force of these X-rays. Your skin gets blasted full of holes, and your body has to fix all the holes. No problem. But after 40 or 50 or 60 years, your skin starts to lose the war, and it cannot keep up with the damage, and your skin begins to wrinkle up. But before the flood, that didn't happen. The Bible says before the flood came, the people lived to be more than 900 years old.
So here's what happens when we plot it all out. We throw up the data points, we plot it down, and lo and behold, again, as a statistician, I'm jumping up and down right now going, you can't make this stuff up. And I really mean it. You can't make this stuff up.
I mean, either you can, or the Sumerians did it better, because their fit is better at least on some regressions. I'm not going to take the time to do all of them. Also, I noticed that he's using data points that are not the same as the ones in the previous graph of ages from genealogies, but whatever. But also, you can't just use p-values as a naive indication of the chance of something being due to random noise. It's related to that, but the American Statistical Association notes that it's not so simple. Plus, even taken the naive way Dan takes it, this very low p-value isn't the chance that the data is real, it's the chance that it's not completely random. But we wouldn't expect it to be random. It was written by people for a reason, and they had a reason for including the ages at all, and for having them decline. The only reason he can say that this is some big discovery is because he already set up the false dichotomy that the only way for these numbers to have been put there without reference to an actual history is for there to have been a millennia-long multi-generational conspiracy. In fact, all that's needed is some dude with some basic mathematical skill.
It slopes down in a way that's statistically predictable, where 95% of the data points are falling along a predictable pattern called the power law curve.
Okay, so far in responding to this, I've been taking it in good faith that Dan is just presenting the numbers in the Genesis genealogy as he finds them in the Masoretic text. In fact, he presented that as a data table, and it's the data table I used to get my second-order polynomial curve of best fit with its r-squared value of 0.8787. So what's this graph then? Well, it turns out it's figure 3 from Genetic Entropy Recorded in the Bible ? By John Sanford and Christopher Root, published near as I can tell, just on the internet as a PDF. The data table for this has some interesting aspects. For one thing, notice that there's only one age in the graph for one generation after Noah. Turns out that's Shem. Where did Japheth and Ham go? Well, they aren't in the data, because obviously if you have 3 data points with different y values all on the exact same x value, it's going to decrease the fit value and increase your p-value. Further, you might note that there's a big gap after the middle part of the graph until the next data point. That's King David. What about all the other kings with known ages? Even the ones who died of natural causes as opposed to the ones who died violently. I mean, it seems fair to exclude the murdered people, since clearly their ages at death don't reflect lifespan. But, what about the others? Oh, you see they go up and down, and so, again, decrease the closeness of the fit and increase the p-value. Then, of course, we skip down to average Roman life expectancy, which helps finish off the tail of this with a nice low value of 45. What's the problem with that? Well, life expectancy isn't the same thing as lifespan. The thing is that the lifespan is how old a member of a population will live on average, assuming that they do not die of something that can't be attributed to old age, like a sudden plague, murder, etc. The lifespan of Romans and the age of King David would be pretty much the same, again lowering the closeness of the fit and increasing the p-value. So when Dan says you can't make this up, what he really means is that anyone can make this up if they just pick numbers that work on either tail of the graph and exclude numbers that don't work so well. This is intentional p-hacking. This is manipulation of the sample in order to get a desired level of statistical significance. Sanford and Root are lying in this paper. There's no way around it. Sanford at least knows enough about statistics, being a former scientist, to know better. I want to thank Marshall Jansen of the BioLogos forums, whose post led me to the source of this graph, and pointed me towards the data table for figure 3. I don't even know who you are, Marshall, but I greatly appreciate you making my life just that much easier.
So they're predicting, and you guys, the Bible scribes from thousands of years ago, they didn't know advanced math.
Why not? This was done in Babylon. Babylonians did square roots, squaring, division, fractional notation. A well-educated Babylonian was probably better at math than the average U.S. high school graduate, and the average high school graduate can square a number, multiply numbers, and divide numbers. That's all it would take to create this correlation. But let's remember, the correlation isn't real in the first place. It only appears if you cherry-pick the data to get the best fit with the lowest p-value possible, without looking too much like that's what you're doing.
They didn't know how to square things and cube things.
Like I just said, there is absolutely no reason to think that's true. Babylonians were quite good at math, and the authors, or at least the redactor of Genesis, lived in Babylonia. They figured out the value of the square root of 2 to several decimal points. Why does Dan have so little faith in the abilities of the authors of the Bible who got the Bible to us? Personally, I hate it when edgelord atheists call the Hebrew Scriptures books written by Bronze Age goat herders, when in fact they were written by highly educated Iron Age scribes. I guess Dan agrees with those edgy atheists.
And develop, probability values and ANOVAs and R squares.
I'll grant that they probably didn't do that. They probably didn't know about p-values and r-values and such, but who cares? The correlation is made up anyway. Sanford and Root had to cherry-pick data to get their p-hack statistics anyway.
And you just can't have someone invent this stuff where these dots, their lifespans, fall along such a predictable slope. Something else is going on.
Yeah, that something is called intentional p-hacking. It's generally considered from bad form to outright academic fraud.
And it's happening so strong that its likelihood is not, when I would testify as an expert about statistics in court, I just had to beat the 5% level of chance. Well, then you've got 1% or 0.1, 0.5%. But this is statistically significant, off the chart. It goes all the way into the quadrillions. The curve fit of this line shows that there's a phenomenon going on with our lifespans that is not a chance occurrence. Something is happening.
Well, yeah, it wasn't by chance. It was specifically and nakedly fraudulent, albeit not in the criminal sense. Sanford and Roop decided that genetic entropy, their made-up incoherent bullshit, was the cause of the decline in lifespans, and that a good statistical fit would make that seem more plausible. So they cherry-picked ages from the Bible and then used the wrong age from historical research for Romans, all in an effort to get evidence to support their pet idea, if it even counts as an idea. This is the exact opposite of doing science. This is the kind of thing I mean when I say that creationists and real scientists don't have the same data, because creationists intentionally leave out relevant data. Even data as important as the fact that Noah is supposed to have had 3 sons and not just 1, can get flushed down the drain if it doesn't fit with the conclusions creationists must reach, no matter what the data are.
And these old guys writing with feather pens and little monk hats couldn't have done it. They couldn't have done the advanced math to pull that off. So,
what is Dan even talking about? The people making copies of the Bible didn't have to be in on anything. Even if we pretend that his amazing statistics weren't just cooked up by Sanford and Roop, which they demonstrably were, the scribes are just copying down what the previous copy said. All they would need to do is just not screw up too badly. They didn't need to be investigating the numbers. I feel like Dan doesn't even have a coherent model of reality in his head. So much of what he says is just bafflingly nonsensical. How does this man even function day to day? Based on what he says, it seems like he's the kind of guy who would pour coffee into his ear, then use his toothbrush to wash his eyeballs before tossing some neckties on his feet and attempting to drive his garage to work.
We can take this data, for example.
These data.
We can plot it all out, and using the data itself, we can predict lifespan intervals. So we can take the curve itself mathematically and predict, well, this guy should have lived 275 years, this guy should have lived 130 years, and all the data fits perfectly within it.
Wow, the data Sanford and Roop used to generate this curve fits within the margin of error of that curve? How shocking that this mathematically inevitable fact is in fact a fact.
So you can't have these Bible scribes knowing polynomial math or exponential math.
Remind me in the comments, how much math would a scribe who's just transmitting a text need to know in order for 2 liars in the 21st century to cherry-pick numbers from the books they copied and then find a curve that they themselves designed? I feel like it's none. But also, if we're talking about scribes down the ages, then exponential math has been well understood for like 4,500 years or more. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't know that, even if their knowledge of it is utterly irrelevant. As for polynomials, yeah, near as I can tell, they came out in like the 17th century or so. So I guess they wouldn't have known that. And remember that right above the comments and below this video is a join button. That will let you become a member of the channel starting at only $1.99 US a month. You get early access to videos, channel emojis, and a membership chat each month.
And logarithms and things like that.
Sure, logarithms were also a product of the 17th century mathematics, but again, who cares? Even if the curve of the lifespans were as exact as he's pretending, the fact is that logarithms can be applied to numbers that were invented before logarithms were known to exist. A logarithm is basically asking what number do you need to raise a number to in order to get another number. So the log base 10 of 1,000 is 3, because 10 to the third power is 1,000. The log base 10 of 3,000 is about 3.47712125471966625. Because when you raise 10 by that exponent, you get 3,000, then a decimal place, then like 11 zeros, then a 1 and a bunch more numbers or so, which is really close to 3,000. But do you need to know that in order to multiply 10 by itself a bunch of times, or to use the number 3,000, or the number 3.48, or anything like that? No, of course not. Nothing in the Bible indicates that the author would have had to use any advanced math to come up with the ages if they weren't real. They don't even fit the curve Dan thinks they fit nearly as well as he thinks. I mean, hell, the math Dan is relying on doesn't even notice that Noah had more than one son.
So something's going on with the data itself that couldn't have been invented by Bible scribes.
But it could have been invented by a couple scammers trying to support the stupidest idea in the history of population genetics.
In fact, just think about it from a practical level. If you were trying to pitch this myth idea of your religion called the Bible or Judaism or Christianity or whatever it was, why on earth would you write about people living for hundreds and hundreds of years? Because it would go against the credibility of your case.
Not in a cultural context where such ages are common in things like genealogies and king lists. That would be entirely ordinary and expected. The problem Dan is having is that he doesn't realize that the context of the ancient Near East and the context of modern-day 21st century California are not at all the same context.
But they're writing these long lifespans even despite of that. So,
no, they're writing them specifically because that is what would be expected. Dan just refuses to put the biblical text into the context of the culture that produced them and to which their target audiences belonged. He cannot escape from the mindset of a 21st century American statistician. It's beyond him. And what's the context in which Genesis came into more or less its present form? The Babylonian exile, something Christians generally are aware of.
Here we go. They would have to carry on that lie over about 3,000 years of biblical history. You'd have to have all these authors in it, handing the baton one guy to the next, saying, hey, when you record the lifespans of Shem and Arphaxad and Selah, just take it down a notch, 50 years, 30 years, something like that. Don't take it from 900 years to 80 years. You got to slide it down the scale over time.
Except, none of those people wrote the books in question. Most of them didn't even exist, and pretending that they did in order to make this argument work is, of course, assuming the historicity of Genesis in order to argue for the historicity of Genesis. Once again, Dan is begging the question. But also, I love that evangelicals are usually among Christians the most adamant about rejecting things like the documentary hypothesis of the authorship of the Pentateuch in favor of Mosaic authorship. But here comes Dan saying, nah, it's not one author. It's like 10 or 11 authors, guys. Dan's idea of the authorship of the Bible is fringe even among the most conservative Protestant extremists. This is just completely off the rails. Also note that these alleged authors aren't the scribes and monk hats that he described later. Monasticism in Christianity wasn't even a thing until the 4th century when St. Anthony of Egypt went to live in a cave in the desert to separate himself from what he saw as a wicked and sinful culture, only to gather a following. Monks in Christianity are an entirely post-biblical phenomenon.
There's no way that happened. This is real data, and the Bible proves that out.
You know what? I'll grant that the data is real. It's just that cherry-picked data, while real, don't really tell us much except what the people who did the cherry-picking want to be true, and that those same people don't care about whether it's actually true.
And interestingly enough, you take Luke chapter 3, we have these 77 patriarchs going from Christ all the way back to Adam, and many of the lifespans of these people were in that data plot that I just showed you.
Actually, almost none of them were included in the data table. In fact, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Abinadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Sadok, Achim, Eliud, Eleazar, Matan, Jacob, Joseph, Nathan, Mattatha, Mena, Melia, Jonam, the other Joseph, Judah, Simeon, Adi, Qasim, Elmadam, Eleazar, Joram, Mathat, Levi, Melchi, Neri, Joanan, Joda, Joseph, Simeon, Janai, Matthias, Amos, Nahum, Helsi, Nagai, Math, and Melchi are all on the genealogy graph that Dan is using, but were not in the data table used to generate the figure of best fit curve. Funny how that works, isn't it?
So we go from Christ all the way through King David and Abraham and Noah. These are the 77 patriarchs that go from Jesus back to Adam in just one chapter of the Bible, Luke chapter 3. And this data maps perfectly upon that predicted decay curve that we just went through.
Sounds cool, but is it true? Can we see the data? Why weren't most of them in the initial data set? It couldn't be because the more relevant data you put in there, the less the curve fits, could it? Yeah, that's exactly why.
So I think for me, it really validates the whole of Scripture when you put it all together.
Yeah, well, that's why the data was cherry-picked that way in the first place. So I guess mission accomplished to Sanford and Rube. Too bad about none of it actually working without the cherry-picking, though, isn't it? That's the end of his presentation. But now it's question time, so here's Kent with the first question.
Well, I've got one right away, brother. How do I get that messianic genealogy chart you just showed?
Just Google Jesus genealogy and go to the image results.
I've been a Christian 55 years. I've never heard that. Jesus was the 77th generation.
How has Kent never heard this? First, you can just count. Second, the number isn't an accident. It was put there because the number 7 had special significance to the audience of probably early 2nd century Christians who were familiar with the use of the number in previous Hebrew numerology. The fact that the number of listed generations from Adam to Jesus is a numerologically significant number isn't evidence of historicity. It can be very well explained as the contrivance of the author of the Gospel of Luke, who probably wasn't a guy named Luke. Dan's response is just complaining about old Earth creationist takes on this. That's boring, and I don't really care about two groups of obviously incorrect people arguing about which version of pseudo-history they want to accept. I'm going to cut to the next question.
Well, atheists will say there's a contradiction between Luke and Matthew's genealogy because it switches at King David, which is his different son.
They manifestly do contradict. Just as an obvious example, who was Joseph's father? In Matthew, it's Jacob, and in Luke, it's Heli. So unless Joseph's family was way more progressive than I expect, and Jacob and Heli were a gay couple who adopted Joseph, there's an obvious contradiction.
With Luke, it's Nathan, and with David, it's Solomon.
Yep, that's another contradiction. Which son of David is Jesus' direct patrilineal ancestor changes between the books, as do most of the other names, really.
I mean, with
There you
Matthew,
go.
it's Solomon. It's not a
Yeah,
contradiction.
there's great explanations for all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there is a great explanation for it. The genealogies were written for rhetorical reasons and are not reflective of the actual ancestry of Jesus, not the least because it's almost certain that absolutely no reliable records survived from the time of David into the time of Jesus, but also because we have no reason to think that anyone before David was even a real person, and in some cases we know for certain that they weren't. Any attempt to harmonize these will have to flatly ignore what the text says in at least one of the Gospels. That's because the Gospels don't agree, and forcing them to will require doing metaphorical violence to at least one of the Gospels. Also, we don't actually get any reason why this isn't a contradiction. We just move on to the next question. That's convenient.
Did the flood create the tectonic plates? Kind of seems that way from the theory.
That's actually an interesting question. We have evidence of plate movements well before the Cambrian, but catastrophic plate tectonics doesn't seem to account for this. I wonder what Dan will say.
So
ahead,
I would say yes. I would say I would say that the flood created the Mid-Atlantic ridge and the oceanic rift system of about 40,000 miles.
Then how does Dan account for supercontinents before Pangaea, like Valbara and Rodinia? Those existed and broke up long before the Mid-Atlantic ridge formed.
As far as the tectonic plates itself, I would have to punt to either Steve Austin about that question or Dr. John Baumgardner. I could find that out for you.
Honestly, that's a fair response. He doesn't know the answer within the paradigm he's working in, so he'd rather have someone who he thinks does know give the answer. That's probably the first respectable thing I've seen Dan Biddle do. Now, granted, neither Austin nor Baumgardner have a leg to stand on, and at least Austin is also a known fraud, and Baumgardner is someone who seems to think that simulations that are intentionally set with unrealistic parameters are evidence of the real history of the Earth, so he's either a knowing fraud or an idiot of the highest order. So I'm not sure either of these would really help. But Dan probably doesn't think that that's true of either of them, so I wouldn't expect him to treat them with the respect they deserve, which is more or less none.
But if you look at the way that the plates moved during the flood, there could be a good argument for saying that I think the tectonic plates probably were either created during the flood or shaped during the flood or somehow refined during the flood.
I guess, yeah, if the flood were real and we ignore the heat problems, then sure, the flood would almost certainly have had a profound effect on the tectonic plates of the Earth.
I agree. I think when the fountains of the deep broke open, the Earth cracked up like an eggshell.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Pieces are still floating around. Good. Thank you, Clara, for that question. Any more?
So I guess Kent is just inconsistent on whether or not Pangaea was real. I'm not terribly surprised. He probably doesn't even notice. And of course, our next question is from everyone's favorite author of books that contain truncated and underlined hyperlinks as references, Donnie Budinsky. This is the first time I've bothered to cover anything by him since he made it clear that he's an abusive piece of shit who shouldn't be pissed on if he were on fire, and who also doesn't have an original idea in his brain, and who wouldn't know a massive contradiction if it just slapped him across the face.
I would just like to look at the ordering of the fossil record to argue for common descent. What's the best creationist response to this? Okay, what about the order of the fossil record?
Of course, it's more than just that scientists look at the available fossils and then conclude that evolution explains them. That is true, they do that, but they do much more. They can use evolutionary theory to predict both what kinds of morphology to expect in as of yet undiscovered transitional fossils, but also where they should find them, and they actually get it right. Creationists can, of course, accommodate the fossil record with ever more implausible post hoc rationalizations, but they can't make predictions about it. Evolution can, and does, and gets them right. That's something Donnie in particular likes to call the gold standard in science.
Kent, you've done a lot on this. In fact, I recall you saying before that you really can't find anywhere on Earth where you have a nice, clean, orderly fossil record from the Permian all the way up to the top of the Cretaceous.
Which is irrelevant. Let's say that I collect 6,000 copies of the King James Bible, and from each of them I remove 80% of the chapters randomly, and all chapter and verse numbers. And there is a 1 in 3 chance that for some of them I take what remains and flip some of it around so it's upside down or backwards or something like that. Then I rebind the books. Then I distribute those books, each unique, to 6,000 people and ask them to reconstruct the King James Bible text as it originally existed, minus the chapter and verse numbers. And none of them are allowed to reference any complete copies of the King James. And I'll stipulate that none of them are familiar with it. Could they do it? It seems obvious that yes, they could. They could easily see that, except in cases where the text is clearly upside down or backwards, that there is an obvious ordering. The text of Genesis 1 always comes before Genesis 2, and Genesis 2 before 3, and so on. But even when some of the chapters are missing between the parts of the text, they're still not out of order unless the text itself has been flipped, which itself is reasonably obvious and easy to correct. Provided that the group has all the chapters between the 6,000 of them, they will successfully reconstruct the text. That's how the stratigraphic column is. In no one place do we tend to have an unbroken depositional environment since the Cambrian, but we do have deposition preserved in the rocks all over the world and always in the same order. When the order is violated, we see things like evidence of uplift, folding, etc., which when corrected for, gives us the order back. Just like none of the Bibles were complete, no single locale is likely to be complete in terms of stratigraphy, yet this is no barrier to constructing a model of either the KJV or the rock record of Earth.
I can say that the orders or the we can't say sequence, but the grouping of fossils do have a very clean grouping that corresponds with the flood. For example,
weird. Kent has typically held the opposite.
No, very quickly, I think the sudden appearance, first of all, you're still assuming that the fossil record exists and means something. I would disagree with that.
You have the Jurassic layers that are in fact below what we would call the Cretaceous layers, and you do have distinct but similar animals in the Jurassic layers that are different in many respects to the animals that are in the Cretaceous layers.
None of which is predicted by creationism, hence why at least in the past Kent has denied that this very obvious fact about the fossil record is even true. Creationism just attempts to accommodate these data, but it generally fails. Let's see what failed excuse Dan has for us.
But that's just because you have different zones and regions and habitats and ecological systems that are being buried in different sequences during the flood.
Ah yes, ecological zonation. The way that we know that Pisanosaurus, a Triassic reptile, lived right on the coast, while Tylosaurus, a Cretaceous reptile, must have lived in one of those high-elevation oceans I hear so much about. That makes perfect sense. Oh wait, no it doesn't. It is completely contradicted by just the very basic observation that in situ marine fossils are found throughout the whole column.
So one of our videos talks about the Sauk mega sequence.
That's the Sauk cratonic sequence. It's a record of one of the earliest sea transgressions in North America. It does not correlate to depositions outside North America, and it is not a record of a single flood. Instead, it's composed of numerous strata with diverse marine depositional environments. Most of them are low-energy deposits, precluding this from being a flood deposit. The term megasequence is, near as I can tell, a creationist original. When you search for it, you generally just get creationist sources or debunking sources about creationism.
Which is the first one to go. There's evolutionists even agree to what's called the SLOSS mega sequences, the SLOSS. Dr. Tim Clary has done a lot with this, but
that's just yet another cratonic sequence recording another sea transgression with the same diversity of environment and the same evidence of absolutely precluding a catastrophic origin for the sequence as a whole.
With ICR, the first three to happen were the Sauk, Tippecanoe, and Kaskaskia.
Ah, good. The cratonic sequence gang is all here.
They were all marine sequences.
Yes, when sea levels rise, allowing the interior of continents to be part of the ocean, you tend to get marine sequences. But, marine and flood environments aren't the same thing.
And over 80 to 90% of the fossils in those three sequences are all marine creatures.
Yeah, because that's who lives in the ocean, and when there's a sea transgression, the ocean is where there'd otherwise be land. None of this is helping Dan's case. All of it is just the same thing that when scientists look at, they see the inescapable evidence of deep time.
We don't get the land creatures being buried until the Zuni-Sloss megasequence, which is the fourth, which happened at the zenith of the flood.
But from then on, and even before, the idea of going up in elevation doesn't help. And further, the higher cratonic sequences are also marine, because you can't be a record of a sea transgression without being marine. So this doesn't really help. It doesn't do anything to indicate that you're going uphill. Instead, the only real explanation is that in the earlier sea transgressions, there just were no significant land animals to be washed into the sea.
So if you look at our, let me see, if you go to our YouTube channel and look at our most watched flood video, we
Pass.
get into the Sloss mega sequences, but they're all, there's not an order and it's not a sequence. It's a sequence of burial, but not a sequence of evolution.
Cool story. Now, if only there were any actual evidence to back that up, instead of literal mountains of evidence that flatly contradict it. And do note that all this ecological zonation would have to be under a flood that's actually steam, if not plasma, so it couldn't leave behind any kind of marine deposition. Dan doesn't have a solution to the heat problem, and so far he hasn't even bothered to note that his own model would vaporize the oceans many times over. Oops.
I tell people on our tour, clams are usually found at the bottom because they're already at the bottom when the flood starts.
Except that they're not just found at the bottom. Clams are found throughout the highest layers, including the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. That fact on its own should give anyone pause to consider how clams managed to get up so high. Did they run to the mountaintops? That hardly seems likely.
Of course, they're the first ones buried.
Except that the problem is that they're not found in the lowest layers. They don't show up until the Devonian. Where are all the Cambrian bivalves? Oh, but what's this? It's Halkieria, an early Cambrian mollusk that sure looks like a missing link that's going from the most basal mollusk on to becoming a real clam in a few tens of millions of years. Weird how even with Ken's favorite example, evolution and common descent work way better than ecological zonation, isn't it? But also, that's it. After that, Ken just thanks Dan for coming by, and Dan gives his contact info again. Well, I, for one, am glad that's over. I guess it was interesting that at no point did Kent give any pushback on Dan, even in the cases where I know he believes differently than Dan. Donnie does that too. He'll agree with basically anything a friendly guest says, even if the day before another guest said exactly the opposite. Maybe being an invertebrate is just a job requirement for being a pro or semi-pro creationist. Oh well. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ella Runteller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.